Yeah, so actually, what do you remember about React?
It's a component-based front end.
It's component-based front end. What do we mean by component-based?
We can take pieces of code and use it as modular attachments to create a reusable app.
Right. So we break our app into components, and we can reuse those components just like Lego pieces. Yeah. You
So
will.
I was gonna say it like makes everything kind of like easier or like easier to like see and adjust changes in real time.
Do you mean like it helps? It's easier to think about an app when we're doing it in React versus vanilla JavaScript and HTML? That's correct. Yes. The fact that connected to what Jonathan said, React allows us to think of our apps as components put together. Um, Help us develop faster and better. Anything else? How do we initialize a React app? How do we create some scaffolding? Yes. Not exactly, but how do we like? So you see how when we initialize like a Git repo, or when we initialize an npm project, we run some commands. They create React app, and you can run create a React app if you download it globally, and then you just do create React app, the name of your app basically. Um, so to initialize a React project, we can do create React app, let's say my app, and this will initialize a React app with the name my app. You could also do it with npx, as Suzette indicated. With npx create React app, the same steps. Cool. So that's how we can initialize that. What are some of the files that you found on a React app, on the scaffolding for a React app? Yes, Douglas.
A public folder and a source folder?
Public folder and a source folder. Most commonly, like whenever we create apps with create React app, this is the structure those apps are going to have. Public folder and a source folder. What else? What is some stuff inside of the source folder? Here, more generally, we're gonna end up with a file called app.js. And very often a components folder. This app.js is sort of like the main component that will wrap and hold everything else. This is where you're gonna import other components that you create. This is like good practice to have. If I create a component, like in this case, what we did was we created a contact list, right? So we're all some contact. .jsx. And any components that we create is good practice to have it in the components folder. Cool. Questions around the app structure? Also on source, you always have an index.js, which we're not going to touch much. But the index.js is the one in charge of rendering your app component, your main component, onto the actual DOM. Right. Cool. So let's look at, so now talking about components, what do they look like? How do we make them? Char?
You use them by making JSX code.
We use them by making JSX code. Yes, talk a little bit more about that, or Joey.
We extend the React component, making a new class.
That's correct. So if we look in here, in my components folder here, I have a contact list JSX. This component is defined as a class. We define a class called contact list that extends from React component, as Joey said. If you don't extend from React component, you're gonna see a big error. Anything else about this component? Jonathan?
Using the render function to return a HTML element.
So we're doing every component, as Jonathan says, has to have a render method, a render function. If your component doesn't have a render function, then there is nothing that will show up in the screen. The render is sort of the thing that makes it appear in the screen. And that function has to return JSX code that looks like this. JSX code, remember that JSX is sort of a mix between HTML and JavaScript. And then this is a representation of what the actual thing once it gets put in the DOM is going to look like. It's going to have a div, an h1, a UL, etc. So those are this is what a component looks like. We're going to get into more about like this component. So it turns out that app.js, I'm going to put here on the side. App.js is also a component. So there are two types of component. One is a functional component that is written as a function, and another one is a class component that is written as a class. Both do the same thing for now, and we're going to get into more details later on. For this, you could, at this point, they are exactly the same. It's just that one is written as a function, the other one is written as a class. Now, when it's written as a function, just return, that function returns the JSX straight. When it's written as a class, it must have a render function that returns the JSX. That's it. So once we have this component, what we did was, if we look at app.js, let's open app.js and contact list. If we look at app.js, what we're doing here is just importing that class that we exported. We're importing that class from the folder components, the file contact list, and then we could just use our component by calling it like this, like a sort of a custom HTML tag. That's it. Once we have this, how do we run our React app? npm start. So I think I have it here. Let's see. Yeah, it's my simple social app. This is the folder that we were working on last time. In here, I can do npm start. Hopefully, I don't have it running somewhere else. Let me run it again. I think I had it running somewhere else. I just killed that. Remember that React will spin up a server that just keeps track of files, and it let us do hot reloading where you can just save and the changes will appear immediately, which is a really nice feature. And then we have our React app here. this is what we have so far. So let's move this here, move React to the side. Questions to this point? Everything's making sense. Yes, Davida.
Every time you add a new component, do you have to add it to app.js for it to work?
Yes, for now, yes. Everything must be at some point connected to app.js. Yes, John.
You said that contact list.js and app.js are the same thing?
They are the same thing in the terms that they are both components. App.js is written as a function. We call it a functional component. App and then contact list. They're both components, right? But this one is written as a function. This one is written as a class. What they share is they're both components.
You still need to use them both at the same time.
What do you mean by use them both at the same time? What we have basically is this. Let's see. Do we have an eraser anywhere? Anywhere in the tables? I guess I'm gonna use this. So we're gonna be thinking the same way that when we were building apps with just HTML, this is not working. There it is. So to answer Joanne's question, they are being used both in the sense that we have app.js and then app.js. App.js is our main component, but app.js is importing and is using the contact list. So we can think of contact list, and this is actually the language that we use in React. Contact list is a child. It's a child of app, right? Because it's like contact list is within app. If we look at the app component here, you can see that the app component is going to be this, and inside we have contact list. So our main components will always go in app.js, right? So other questions? Okay, so let's create one more component so that you can get to work in the lab. This one is, let's say we want to add, and the next thing was adding the feed. Yeah, so here we have like our contact list. If you didn't get through this, I recommend you do. So for the feed, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new component file. So I'm going to open here on my components folder here, create a new file. Let's call it feed.jsx. We import React from React. Let's create this component as a class. Feed pros extends. Remember that there's always a need for extending the React component class. I'm going to close this side here. There's a feed.jsx file inside of the components folder. Then I don't want to forget my render function, so I'm going to include it here. In fact, let's do this. So let's have this function return just a div with an h2 that says feed. Just like this. So this is already a component because it's a class that has a render function. But then I just need to export so that somewhere else we can import it and use it. So let's export it. Export default feed. And then in app.js, I'm going to put it here to the side. In app.js, I'm just going to import feed from components/feed. And then I'm just going to use feed here. For using a component, once it's exported, we use it like this, as if it was a custom HTML tag with angle brackets. We save that there. Now we go to the browser. Now we have our component rendering. It's just a component that has an H2 tag, doesn't have much. Questions up until this point? For the lab, you're going to need to create, let's see how many components. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 components. And you will do so in this same fashion. Creating a file with the name of the component, a class with a render method that returns some JSX. So let's add, in this case, we have some posts. Let's see. Okay, in this case, we have like only feed post. Let's see. Okay. So what we're gonna do is this. We're gonna have another component. Feed. And the goal of this component is to just render a list of posts. And then children of this component will be individual single posts. Joe, you have a question?
Is it possible to define multiple components on one file?
Yes, it is possible to define multiple components in one file, as long as you export one that maybe groups them all. That would be fine. It is very uncommon to export multiple components from one file. Yeah. Other questions? So this is what we're going to have. We have a feed component that's going to render a list of posts, basically. And this can be its own components here. So let's do this. So we're rendering our feed, and we know that our feed is going to render a list. So let's do maybe a UL. And here, even though I haven't created this component, I'm just going to call it post. Make maybe a few of them. I haven't created the post component, but that's what we're going to do next. The only purpose of feed is just to render a list of components, right? So then let's go on to create another file for our post component. So in components, I'm just going to create a new file called post.jsx. Let's open it here to the side. Same drill. Import React from React class post extends React.component. Render return a div. And let's maybe do this a paragraph for now. This is a single post. And then don't forget to export. Export default post. And then let's import it here. Import post from components. Since we're in the same file, feed is in the same folder as post. So we just need to do current folder / post. Just like this. So we're putting post into feed.js, yeah. We're importing post into feed.jsx and then just in feed using post. So this is something that like is really hard for us to do if we think about like on the regular way that we were building websites with HTML and JavaScript, because like how do we put like a piece of code inside of another one, right? But yeah, this is like the nice thing. This is why we use React, the Lego-like building experience. So let's see what we have in our website. We'll lower this here maybe. If I go to React, have context, and I have a list of posts. The posts are, all of them says this is a single post, right? And that's okay because this is just a demo. So this is, now we successfully represented this sort of structure. When we're dealing with React, it's very helpful to think of the component tree where we have sort of like a main parent, then we have some children, and then these children may have some grandchildren. And this can be, for Facebook, you can imagine how tall this tree will be, right? All the components that they have. I actually saw recently, let's see, somebody using like an extension to sort of visualize this, and they went on Instagram. So let's see if this works here. React site. Let's see if logging out works. Yeah, no, I unfortunately cannot show you because the extension that was supposed to like show you that where you could see something like this for any React app seems to have some bugs and they haven't fixed it. But you could just think about how, as we're building this app, we're sort of building this tree-like structure. Questions up until this point? So in this fashion, we're using post because post is used in feed and feed is used in app. We render everything that app renders. Therefore, we render everything. We render contact list. We render the feed with as many posts as the contact list has. And then the example that we have here is where we have, where this is what the feed, what the post looks like. So it turns out that, like, you remember what the goal of classes is? Like, why do we have classes in JavaScript? What do classes allow us to represent? Sure.
Real world examples like class class of animals, eyes, ears, and all that.
That's correct. It allows to represent real-world objects, right? And for real-world objects, it's very important to have properties, right? Say a car has a color, it has a make, it has a model, etc., right? So if we remember that in here, we're just dealing with classes, the same old JavaScript that allows to represent objects. But now we're representing a component. Then we remember that we can have properties on those objects, properties on those classes. So we can say, we should always have a constructor when we're having a class. You remember that? And then here I can say, let's do this dot post is equal to, I'm just gonna paste this here. If you review your code from when we learn classes and whatever we're using classes, you can see that you can have properties on those classes that then all the instances of those classes will have. So what we have here is a constructor so that whenever a new post is made, it will have a post property. And this post property is just an object that has a title, image, link, description. And if we look at, the contact list, the contact list doesn't have a constructor. It actually doesn't need it if we're not going to store anything in the properties of that component. And here we sort of hard-coded like these names here, right? In the future, we're not going to hard-code it. We're going to have them come from our API, for instance. And then we're going to save them somewhere and then get it from there. In here, I don't want to hard code like this. I could create a p tag for this, an image for this, and a description p tag for that. But I don't want to sort of like hard code it. So what we can do once we have this is let's remove this p tag. Or actually, let's keep the p tag. I want to show here the description. And this goes back to the foundation on objects and classes. How do you access the property defined on a class? Something that, yes. But what do we put here before the dot? This keyword. So we refer to itself. And then we have a post property. So we have a post property. So I'm interested in this dot post stat description here. Maybe on an H4, I'm gonna put this dot post dot title. And then the image I'm going to put into img, src. Oops. Oh, my p tag disappeared. Let's close the image here. The source of the image is going to be the link that we have in the post property of this class. Therefore, we do this dot post dot image link. Remember that to put JavaScript in your JSX, we need to do that inside curly brackets. Post that description. And and we have a component that is accessing information that will display information that is kept in its own properties, in the post property. Then let's look to see how this looks like. I have a mistake here. That was parentheses, then parentheses to close the return, curly brackets to close the render, and this last curly bracket is to close the class. If we have that, let's put it here to the side. Let's see, what does it say? Must call SuperL. If you remember, when we have classes that are extending other classes, we need to call the constructor in the parent class, right? So if we're doing, let's say, mammal, a class mammal that will represent a mammal, it's inheriting from animal. Imagine we have another class animal. The mammal class will need to call the constructor in the parent class. The same thing applies here to React. We need to say super to call the constructor on the React component class. Once we have that, I think it should render. And then here we have a list of posts finally displaying. Questions? Yes, Vida.
Message for the class, when it goes to this example, it doesn't use the constructor and it works the same way.
Great question. Great observation. Yes. So it turns out that React saw that creating invoking the constructor and the super was very common, so they just got rid of it. And I think will need to get rid of this. Let's see if this still works. And it still works. The reason that I wanted to show you the constructor way first is because under the hood, this is being put under a constructor. Is that React sometimes does so much magic for us that then we forget, right? But this, let me put it back. Let me actually comment it out and put this one. So React under the hood will add a constructor, will call super, and will initialize a property called post for this component, just as if we were doing constructor manually. I will say go with whatever is more comfortable to you. I think it is very easy to forget that a React component that is a class will call the constructor and the super. So at least while we're getting used to React, I will recommend we have a constructor and a super so that we don't forget. And once that becomes second nature, then you can take full advantage of the syntactical sugar that React gives you by just saying post equal curly brackets. Yes. Other questions or comments? Yes, do this.
Say you needed, for the sake of CSS, to give a specific class or ID, I suppose, for certain elements. Would that still work when you're making your HTML, as it were, within
Yeah, that's a good question. So that was actually my next point. So let's say we want to put a border around this list of posts. The way in which we integrate CSS with our React app is by giving components a class name. So I'm going to go to my feed component, which is this one. I'm going to say this div that is wrapping my header and my list of posts. I want it to have a class of maybe feed. Note here that instead of just class, we need to use class name. We need to use class name because class is a reserved word when we're dealing with React because of this part here, because of constructor, because of JavaScript classes. So that's why instead of class, we need to say class name. Then this will end up putting a class on the class attribute on this div with that name. So if we put that and we inspect our source, and if we go to root, then app, let me open this big so that you can see it. Then we have this div that we see highlighted, and it has the class feed. Then we can just style it. For styling, it's a common pattern in React to just define a file with the same name of the component, feed.css, and then import that file in here. So let's create a file here. I'm gonna call it feed.css. I'm not gonna write anything in it yet. And then here I'm gonna say import, just like that, feed.css. This imports the CSS file, and then we can write some CSS here. So to that file that has the class of feed, to that div I'm going to say feed. Let's do border 1 pixel solid black. I put this to the side. So because I gave it a class name here of feed, then that div will have a class of feed, and if we go back to the browser, we see now that our feed has a border now surrounding. So to import the CSS is a little bit weird, where we just say import this file, nothing specifically from there, just import this file, and that will link it with our CSS. And then here we can just write any CSS. Let's do background color. Let's do aquamarine. We put this to the side, and we see that the CSS is applying there. Let's say we don't want the images to be that big. So I'm going to do it like here. I'm going to say, actually, I should do this in a file that applies only to the post. So I'm going to say, I'm going to create a file called post.css. In here. Same step, post.css. And then I'm going to go to my post.jsx and import my post.css. Intro CSS. Let's put the CSS here to the right side. Oh. And then let's say that, well, I'm gonna give a class to my div that represents a post. Let's say class name equal post. I'm gonna say let's put a border around it so that we see it. Border, do 1 pixel solid blue. Save that. And then let's go back to the browser. And we see that every post now has a border solid blue. This is normal behavior when the image overloads the container. So let's say I don't want my image to be that big, so I'm going to say post any image that is inside of the post. I want to make, say, width 300 pixels. Let's go back. Now our image is a little bit more contained. So this is how we use CSS. The CSS will be exactly the same. It just changes the way that you import it. Let me see. Something you have to be careful about is that CSS by default is still global. Right, so here, for instance, I have my post CSS that is linked to my post JSX, to my post component. However, any style that I define here will affect not only my post CSS, but also anything else. Because at the end of the day, what React is doing is combining all the CSS into one giant file. Basically, we break it down into multiple files for us, the developer, to be more organized and know where we search for code. But at the end of the day, React is putting all the CSS together, is putting all the JavaScript together, actually. And that's why if we say H1 here in my post CSS, that this CSS is not only applying to the post component, it's applying to the entire page. Right? That is, if you remember that when React is compiling our app, it's combining all the CSS, it's combining basically all the code into as few files as possible. Questions, comments about using CSS in JavaScript, in React? Yes?
I see your app
Yep.
files from, are you importing both posts and? No, just that's what's something else.
So yeah, I'm not importing post because post, you can think of post as being an indirect import, right? An indirect import of feed, because feed is being imported into our. But what is feed? Feed is feed itself and all the children components, right? Feed brings in as many posts as there are in feed. If we look at the feed.js, we can see that feed is importing posts and it's just creating a few posts. Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Does it still follow priority? Like if the CSS is later, then
Yes, that's correct. The CSS, like the overriding the CSS, yes, the later CSS will apply first. Yeah, that still remains as with the regular CSS that we had. Yes.
Look at this instance. Also, the feed is targeting class feed right there, or is it targeting a different
this one?
files?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. This CSS rule is targeting this div with this name, with this class. Yeah, it's not depending on how we're talking. I wouldn't say this CSS is like targeting this component. It's targeting the div with that class, whatever you define it. But it's very common to have a JSX file, a component file, with a CSS file where all the styles for that component lives. Cool. Yes.
Can you affect a different kind of display within within one of these components while using for the app a separate? Like, can you style the overall app grid and then use flex inside of one of the components for just layout?
Yes, that's correct. You can affect, but that is true to.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I just
through
didn't know
the.
if there were any.
That's correct. Yeah, but those rules still apply.
Okay.
I could style app in a general way, and then target through classes or IDs the other individual components and target those. And for the lab that we have today, which is like replicating this, right? I basically built this component structure, sort of like what we're doing here. You're gonna have like 4 main components, right? Navbar, user profile, post, and contacts. You can style. You're going to style the app using CSS grid because you have to put them in this fashion. Yeah, and then I'm gonna let you think about the rest. But if anything is confusing, make sure that you reach out with your questions. Yes, sure.
Are you gonna upload the stream later?
Yes.
Okay.
Cool. So I think that's it. Let's get started on the lab. Let me select this link. It is also in the Canvas event. Make sure that you reach out with any questions or anything that might be confusing. Yes.
Just Control C stop.
Control C to kill the server, the React app. Yeah. You can work here, you can work in pairs. In fact, you're encouraged to work in pairs. Cool.
Getting a lot of